The Celestial Toymaker was a Doctor Who story broadcast in 1966, the third season of the show. And it's a story that, despite its first 3 episodes being missing, has really lived on in fandom for multiple reasons and in multiple ways. There aren't just multiple ways you can experience the missing episodes now, or the story in general. There's really multiple ways you can come to the story, and there's really multiple ways you can discuss the story. Firstly, we're going to discuss the actual story itself. We're going to spend some time unpacking what we can actually watch, hear, experience of the episodes themselves. And then we're going to go into why on earth is the story the way that it is? Because there's a really, really curious production history to this story. The way these scripts developed is quite fascinating. And so we'll get into that after we've gone through the episodes as we can actually experience them ourselves. And then after that, we'll get into the ways fandom talks about the story. So there's kind of 3 scopes for how we're going to discuss things today. First, going to be a lot of talking about if you watch, read, listen to the story now, what do you think of what you get? Then we're going to go into why did we get what we got? And then we're going to go into and how does everyone else talk about what we've been getting? So, doing all that talking today will be myself, Neo from Australia, along with Ingiga and Oliver, both from the UK. And I guess my first question to both of you is, how did you come to this story in the first place? Do you remember the first time you experienced it? What do you think of the serial in general? What's your story there?
Well, I experienced it the only way you really can, I guess, at this point, which is through the loose cannon reconstruction, I suppose. Well, I mean, you can choose to just stick with the narrated soundtrack, like the CD version, but in terms of actually watching stuff with some semblance of visuals, then the reconstruction is, I guess, the only way. And it's... And what to say about Celestial Toymaker? I mean, it's such an experience, and I think coming away from it, especially in the context of what we know now about what the show is like, it reminds me of nothing so much as the Hartnell equivalent of Once Upon a Time, or Flux more generally. It's a perfect example of what happens when the show is really trying to fill the slot and is otherwise in free fall production-wise. Because it has a lot of those similar qualities, things not quite mattering, things not quite meaning anything, and also just being a really, really bizarre waste of time on the whole. Oliver, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I first watched the Liz Cannon reconstruction with the narration of the top, which I think adds to the momentum of it. It means there's less just flat, silent images. And I watched it, this week. I've seen bits of it around. I think I might have seen the last episode before, but yeah, watched it all this week for the first time. And I basically agree. It's a big mess of a story. It doesn't work. But I think there's interesting bits in there, and there's sections I like. And I spent about an hour afterwards trying to figure out what was going on, especially with the last beat of the story and how that ties things all together. And I think it works a little bit better than it felt like it did when I was watching it, I think.
Why do you both think that, well, in the 80s, J&T tried to have the Toymaker brought back for what was going to be season 23 before the cancellation and trial and all that drama. And then in the 2020s, Russell T Davies tried and succeeded in bringing the Toymaker back as part of the 60th anniversaries. Also, the Toymaker just kind of persists through, they're in a bunch of extended universe stuff, at least alludes to them. You see they get referenced in the Mothership show sometimes. In the Chibnall era, it happened. Why does this character get remembered and attempted to be brought back and sometimes successfully brought back? Big Finish have used them in different things. What's the appeal? Why did this story persist? Especially when the actual episodes were lost. Well, most of them.
Because he's a bit like the Doctor.
That is a good way of putting it. Yeah, I think it's one of those cases where the idea of it had a very powerful after image, even if people couldn't rewatch the episodes themselves. I think just the premise of an immortal game player who is a rival of the Doctor's and can bend reality is just very enticing, because it provides immediate conflict, it's got lots of imagery it brings to mind, and I think people were just really fascinated by the idea that the Doctor could have a rival on that level of power who is also evil in such a specific way of tormenting people with challenges and games and twisted things like that and bringing toys to life and all sorts of things. It is quite a strong idea. And I think you can see the strength of that idea in how people have tried to reimagine it over, the ensuing years. Like John Dorney's audio adventure Solitaire is basically just a straight up reimagining of the Toymaker. But that's a really good audio that really delves into the idea of what is the Toymaker as a game player and how might a Toymaker game kind of affect the Doctor and the companion. So I think there are a lot of ways you can go with it. It's just that the original serial didn't go anywhere with it.
Yeah, I agree. I think a big part is that the Toymaker's introduced having already met the Doctor. Not quite in the... It's maybe indicating at something more epic. And then when you get into the details, it's just they've bumped into each other once before, and the Doctor's attitude is very much, oh, this guy again. Crikey. It's like when the Master first turns up. Or second turns up, depending on who you ask.
Even acknowledging the details there, I think just the fact that the Doctor has a knowledge of this character before the serial, and this character has enough of a reputation in the universe that the Doctor can know about them and want to get away as soon as possible upon meeting them. I think that does contribute to the sense of a wider lore, if you like. If you're the sort of person who's obsessed with like other cosmic figures in the Doctor Who universe, then anything, even just a little nugget like that, is going to stick out to you and maybe get those lizard brain sensors tingling.
Although, what strikes me is that in this story, he's really not actually very powerful. I mean, it's a very small scale. The whole thing takes place in a series of small rooms. It's more like a kid's Saw than it is a sweeping epic about cosmic entities. It's like Saw for kids with playground puzzles and stuff.
And I think the element of it that is kind of like a demonic game show is, I think, maybe like the nugget of something quite interesting there. Because, many, many years later, we get the Bad Wolf game station and, the whole idea of like the characters being put through these, I guess, entertainment spectacles. And the challenges that the Toymaker makes Stephen and Dodo go through in the serial, they kind of bring to mind that kind of sort of TV game show type thing, total wipeout, the whole thing where the contestants have to jump on stuff and climb around stuff and kinds of things. And then in another case, there's like an escape room type puzzle. Like, it resembles real game shows that exist, except here it's done with fictional characters, which does make it slightly pointless, but I think it's trying to, I guess, evoke that sense of playing around, at least.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting. It's a clear case of the mythology outliving the story itself. Probably related to the fact that it got lost. But, you hear about a toy maker who makes man-sized toys come to life and animates these puzzle rooms. And, you think about it the way that the Extended Universe and now the main show thinks about it as this cosmic game player. But that's really not that in the serial itself.
Yeah, it's worth remembering maybe that watching fictional characters solve puzzles is not necessarily that entertaining. I think maybe you have to do a bit more work to make it entertaining. I think as much as puzzles can be fun to do in real life, watching other characters do them maybe not that great.
Exactly. There's that's something that struck me as really interesting, is the way that the puzzle itself, a character figuring out a puzzle is really just a person looking at a thing for a while and then having an answer. Where you can do puzzles with audiences, and, for example, games are all about playing puzzles with audiences, but that's a very different thing, and the story's not quite sure which it wants to be. It shows up the riddles at the end of each episode, as if, go home and think about these and maybe you'll get an advantage in the story. But you can't solve the riddles before the next story's aired, because the sections of the riddle just pay off one by one.
Yeah.
As new elements come into the story. So you can't, figure out, this means a river, and therefore we need to get in the river. There's no actual ability to figure out the puzzle before the next episode. So why put it in the credits?
Yeah. they're not actual riddles so much as just next episode teasers.
Exactly, yeah.
So that was something disappointing. When you see the riddle brought up on screen, you think, oh, is there going to be an audience participation element here? And there just completely isn't. Like, it's not there at all. It's like pretending to be something much cleverer when the reality is maybe not even remotely clever.
Which, I mean, the Trilogic game, right? That's technically very clever, I guess. You have to be fairly smart to figure out how to do that perfectly first try with no mistakes. But it's not, in fact, impressive to watch.
Yeah, and the fact that they repeat the sequence of the Doctor going through the Trilogic game every single episode in the exact same way, it's a very telling instance of how much they were trying to fill time in this serial. And it does, pretty much perfectly embody how watching someone solve a puzzle is not that great. But also, even the internal logic of what the Toymaker is putting the Doctor into feels very inconsistent. Like, the Doctor breathes too loud, and the Toymaker's like, you're now skipping several moves in the game, fuck you. Or, the Doctor, like, puts a foot out of line, and the Toymaker's like, okay, I'm skipping ahead of the game. So it's like, the rules feel pointless almost, because the Toymaker can just, like, fast forward it or change something whenever he wants. So it's not even really a game with concrete rules you can follow.
Yeah. Also, the skipping ahead is, I mean, that's helpful, right?
Mm.
He does it as a threat, but it's that the Doctor, sort of wants to finish the game. He's not throwing a spanner in the works, he's just putting the bit on fast forward. I feel like in the Trilogic sequence, there's meant to be, like, two pressures on the characters. Two pressures on the Doctor. One in that if he doesn't solve it perfectly, they all die. But also, he needs to solve it after the other two solve all their puzzles. So there's a reverse time pressure.
Yes, that's correct.
He needs to do it slowly but accurately. But I mean, he's playing by himself. He can go as slow as he likes. He can just stop for a bit if he wants to.
I suppose the only constraint there is that if he just stops doing it, the Toymaker will be like, you broke the rules, skip to move 300 and whatever. So it's a sense of, it's basically just a way of inserting a countdown into the story that is just moving and is going to arbitrarily finish at some point. Just to try and increase the tension in a way that it doesn't really.
Yeah, really bizarre. And I think it works that the Toymaker cheats. I think that's good. I think that's part of the story, that he's a big cheat, and he sets up all these puzzles with really strict rules and then doesn't obey any of them at all. That's fine. I like that. But the logic, the tri-logic of the Trilogic puzzle and its role in the story just doesn't make a lick of sense.
I will say one thing for the Trilogic sequences. When they devolve to just the Doctor's disembodied hand going around in a circle forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, it does evoke the idea of hell a little bit for me. There is something quite sinister about the idea of just being trapped as a hand solving this puzzle seemingly for all eternity. There is something quite hellish about this story on the whole. Like, even when Stephen and Dodo are stuck with those fucking clowns, the idea that they just be stuck with these high-pitched, shrill clowns like forevermore is just like, oh, that's kind of terrifying. I wouldn't say it's a super horror story, but certainly, some of the ideas here are kind of dark.
Yeah, I think it's effectively quite creepy in parts. The clowns, like you say, all the people that those two actors are recast as. You've got the King and the Queen and the Colonel and the housemaid. Each that feels that there's something hellish about that. The same figures being recast in all these different roles again and again and again.
And yeah, I would say the trouble there is that I feel the serial is kind of ambivalent on whether or not they even count as people.
Yes.
Because there seems to be a real back and forth there. We get Dodo saying, like, hey, well, if they're not real, why are you so angry at them? What if they are real? What if they're real people? But then it always seems to, when it eventually shows them getting reduced back to dolls again or playing cards again, it just feels like a shrug. It doesn't really seem, I guess it's because the scripts never really do a great deal to try and bring these out as characters, or even like comedic characters, to be honest. It feels like there were lots of opportunities, especially with the playing card characters and the pantomime Sergeant and Mrs. Wiggs characters, to be really funny, then it's not very funny. I don't think it's a particularly funny story with lots of gags, in my opinion.
I mean, there's something in that. I think Dodo argues that they're people, and there's a bit of a back and forth that doesn't end up coming to anything. But in the moment, I think that's an interesting characterization. One of the companions is convinced that these toys could be people in their own rights. The other one's convinced they couldn't. The argument itself is sort of interesting, but like you say, doesn't go anywhere. It's not like the toys end up leading a revolution against their Toymaker.
There's a weird note near the end where it seems like they're trying to do almost like a Toy Story thing, where they suggest like, oh, what if the toys in your home could have secret inner lives and they're really alive when you aren't looking? Something like that. Which, again, it's like kind of non-committal, but it's just in there as a really strange left field sort of moment. So I guess that's kind of the biggest gesture at a wider point, the whole toy thing. And again, it is very, I wouldn't say it's necessarily that tied to the wider story, because I guess when you're looking at what the Toymaker set up with these characters appearing, you keep thinking like, okay, is it going to be revealed that the Toymaker kind of kidnapped people and forced them to do this, or the the Toymaker transformed people into this, or did something like that, and will there be some moment where we maybe try and save these characters, or will there be some moment where we find out what these characters' lives were like before the Toymaker did this to them, or whatever, or has the Toymaker just created these entities out of nothing? And again, the fact it does not actually, the fact that does not land anywhere, it just has each of them get completely destroyed one after another in ways that after annoying the main characters for a long period of time. I think it's just the lack of willingness to, I guess, explore the ideas just kind of hurts the serial overall.
Yeah, there's so much time spent on, I mean, just waddling about in different rooms, bickering about the same things again and again. And there are ideas, like you said, there's stuff in there. There's notions, and I'm sure we'll get to the colonial stuff in a bit. But I think as a bottom line, the story doesn't make any room. It's got all this room in it, and it doesn't make any room to actually forward its themes. So you end up with an introduction, and then 3 and a bit episodes of just playing some games, and then a conclusion. And nothing in that second act of the middle bit actually forwards the characters. It doesn't present any real drama between them.
You can feel how often the episodes are underrunning, because so many times the characters just regurgitate information that you already know and that they already know. They just rehash the rules of the game and the situation they're in and the stakes of the situation, like in just these lengthy back and forths again and again. So there is a real feeling of we're just wasting time here. I mean, it almost becomes meta at some points, because the Toymaker kind of alludes to the fact that he's putting these obstacles in Stephen and Dodo's way to waste their time, to slow them down, to just get in the way. Or he's throwing these characters at Stephen and Dodo to distract them. They are just noise. They are just audiovisual noise to distract Stephen and Dodo. And that's the role they actually serve in the serial as well. So it's accidentally meta in that way. It's like it's commenting on how empty it is in itself.
And I do think that's intentional to a degree, in that you've got this whole toy room is a little pocket world that doesn't really exist and definitely doesn't matter. The whole story's set in sort of arbitrary space. Everything here's a game, it's not important. Literally nothing matters. And there's a hint at that at the end as well, I think, when they do the Toymaker will return. You know, he's going to be back, we're going to be fighting him forever. Which we these days have sort of backwards interpreted as an epic. There's going to be a war across forever. But in the story, to me, it reads a lot more like, oh, we're going to be stuck doing this. We're going to be doing these arbitrary games. We're going to be getting distracted forever. It's never going to go away. We're never going to be able to actually move on with our lives. To me, it feels like the story itself is sort of that trap of unimportance, which doesn't make for a very good story, of course. But I also think it's interesting how we've replaced that in fandom, I suppose, with an idea that it's actually epic, when that doesn't seem the intention of the story at all. never mind the execution.
I will say the inane and repetitive nature of the Toymaker's challenges, it does start to become twistedly almost reverse enjoyable by like part 3. Like when we get to the point where Sergeant Rugg and Mrs. Wiggs are just trashing a dining room and throwing like plates and food at each other, I was kind of starting to laugh, despite myself. There's something brazen about Doctor Who, supposedly a proper show, just devolving into this meaningless, anarchic frenzy for long stretches of time, basically becoming Dick and Dom in the Bungalow, except, as an actual filmed piece of TV, like scripted television. There's something so insane about it that I almost have to respect, because it feels like a practical joke at times played on the audience, even though it's not really that, but the fact that it's just so brazenly wasting the audience's time, there is something farcical about it.
RTD's Nolly gives this bit of trivia about Crossroads, that when an episode was underrunning, they would just have a member of the crew call into the set, and they'd have to stage a conversation to pad out, and both that feels like what this story is doing, and literally the Toymaker calls into the puzzles every now and then to just sort of distract them for a bit. The phone rings, they have to answer it, they get distracted for a bit, and then they have to go back to the puzzles. It's funny that it's exactly the same thing that Crossroads did. Yeah, and on that note, even at certain points in the story, it almost feels like the actors are improvising, even if they aren't necessarily. I mean, they probably weren't, but it strongly feels like they are, because some of those conversations and interactions feel so aimless. So there is a real sense of, we're just making this up as we go along. We have no idea what we're doing. There's so much. Don't you remember one scene ago?
Would you believe the actors for Stephen and Dodo are quite liked filming this?
I can believe that, because they're basically just playing these big, silly, like, game show games, aren't they? Like hopscotch and like jumping on things, they're climbing around things. It's a bit of a silly waste of time. It's a holiday almost for them. They don't do any real acting.
And it's because of a holiday for the real Doctor. They're the leads of the second and third episodes completely. So I get the appeal for them. If people, because of the 60th anniversary or whatever other reason, try to revisit this serial in any form, the novelization, maybe the recons, maybe the soundtrack, maybe the actual fourth episode, what impression do you think they'll get of Stephen and Dodo? Like, if this is the first experience someone really has with Stephen and Dodo, how do those characters scan to them? What are the characters' deals? Because it doesn't really say like their backstory or anything. It's not like the show is just randomly reiterating who they are every serial, but how do their identities come across in this story?
Dodo's sort of possibly naively empathetic and humanistic, versus Stephen's a bit more brutal, pragmatic, and we're wasting our time. And they swap roles a little bit back and forth in the story. There's a little bit of push and pull on that, but I think mostly Stephen's the driving force of let's stop getting distracted and get this done. And Dodo's maybe a little bit more childlike.
Yeah, I think Dodo maybe gets, as is typical for Dodo, I think probably, she kind of gets a bit the short end of the stick here, I think, in terms of like what kind of character she is and like how she's allowed to kind of influence the narrative. I think, I recall in like episode 4, she has another like which is one of those moments that you kind of get maybe with early companions where they just they freak out, and I think on the whole, again, like we said earlier, it's got so much room in the story, it does so little with it. And I think if you watch this serial, what you come away with from Stephen and Dodo is maybe not even that much, to be honest, because I feel like it's not that specific to them. I feel like even Stephen rhymes. I think even Stephen, what he gets to do in terms of leading the story and being, I guess, maybe the more proactive figure, he's still ultimately he's saying stuff like, we have to look at the chairs, you have to pick up the dolls, don't you this? He's just, he does feel like he does feel very bland here, which is not to like drag like Stephen as a character or Peter Purves as an actor, I think. But Purves has an unenviable job at some points here. Like when he's trying to do that whole sequence where he blindfolded and climbing over the stuff with the clown honking at him. Like, it's literally just Stephen having to carry that whole sequence. It's a nightmare. But in terms of like character and having a unique identity, I don't feel there's a lot.
Purves got cursed by this story. He took the prop for the trilogic set home and he said it cursed his career because he didn't get any good roles while he kept it, and it wasn't until he gave it away that he started getting good parts again.
Probably because it reminded people of this story. from an acting point of view, that there's something slightly embarrassing about having to make drama and make a big deal out of what is essentially just moving pieces around the board for several episodes, like literally and metaphorically. It's everyone's very up in arms and very, we've got to do this about just moving X thing to Y place or pressing this button this many times. The actual material of the story itself, the games, aren't interesting at all. Which means that for an actor, you're just having to make something out of nothing, which is not easy.
This question might sound sort of absurd because 3/4 of it can't really be viewed very well. But what do you think of the actual presentation of this? Like, obviously, this is cheap, this serial. We'll get into why it's cheap later. But visually, what do you think of the visuals? We talked a lot about visuals when we discussed An Unearthly Child. So what do you think of the visuals here? The sets, the visual storytelling, how does it play for you two?
There are little details I like that robot with the TV in its stomach. That's kind of evocative, and it reminded me of it just made me feel like Mind Robber before there was Mind Robber. There are a few details like that which kind of have a nice sort of fantastical spin to them. But at the same time, they're contrasted quite brutally with the cheapness. So you have this whole dollhouse facade in the Toymaker's big toy room, but there is also a quite clear sense that the rest of this room is just a barren set. So it's always, I guess, this strong contrast of interesting little details with overall kind of half-assed details.
Yeah, I like the way that there's inserts throughout. So when they roll the dice, you get a big insert to show the number they rolled and some other details. I think that's really fun. That's a good use of the medium. There's points at which the cheapness of the sets works to its effect. It really does feel like the sergeant and the maid are in a doll's house, right? It feels like a little play place rather than anywhere that could really exist. So those bits sort of work. The visuals of all the TARDIS is something. And the chairs, I suppose, are a bit fun, although they're reconstructed on the version I watched. There's bits. It's not overall visually impressive in the way that An Unearthly Child was, certainly.
Yeah.
I like the big abstract shapes that you get on some of these like game boards, big triangles, in the final episode, the big thing that with the screen on it, it's like this swirly, like cylinder type thing that spins around. There's someone's having a bit of fun with the set design here, at least, which is nice.
The Trilogic game looks a little bit like a 3-sided TARDIS console. There's something.
Oh.
Toymaker's a Time Lord.
I think the Toymaker's room, kind of how sparse it is, but with all the interesting things scattered around, makes me think of the TARDIS interior, at least the first Doctor's as well. So there's kind of that vibe.
Yeah. And there's, we're meant to be drawing parallels between them. It does feel to me, again, there's this takeaway from this story that the Toymaker's an epic world-creating. Yeah, so when the extended universe, and I imagine probably the giggle in a few weeks, or just before this was released, I don't know. They're doing the Toymaker as this creator of worlds, and the whole universe is a game, and powerful. In this, it really, really reads to me like a guy with a room. A guy with a small amount of power made a room where there's some games in it. Like, the Doctor could do this in a weekend very easily, even at this point. If the first Doctor wanted to make a game room like this, he would just have to redecorate the TARDIS and convince some people to come into it. It's not impressive. There's nothing impressive about the scale. And I think that's the point of the serial, but it's also very odd to watch it going backwards when all this mythology has been built up since.
But they do refer to it in this story as the Toymaker's world, and they do talk about how, the Toymaker's world will be destroyed when he loses the game, but he can make a new world. I think the fact that it is just a room, and like you said earlier, it's basically like Saw, like he's just Jigsaw of the Cosmos, like this criminal trapping people in his little room, as much as that is true. I think the story does want to gesture at it being larger than it is, even if it can't really make those gestures enormously convincing.
Yeah, and certainly at the end when they're going, we'll be fighting the Toymaker forever. There's meant to be something there.
I'm trying to stall explaining why this is like this because I want to mine everything out of it we can without getting meta about it before we do that. Is there anything else just kind of in the meat of these episodes themselves without kind of wondering why this is?
Shout out to the fact the resolution of the story is kind of set up beforehand. Sort of, partially, not entirely. The fact that the recurring motif throughout the story of the Toymaker kind of barking at the game to skip ahead moves is what comes back at the end and forms the end of the story, because the Doctor does that same thing and makes that same effect happen with the cutting between the pieces moving by themselves. That, I wouldn't say it's clever, but it shows the consciousness of a planned story there, which is, you know, maybe more than the rest of the story has to show for itself. The awkward bit is where it involves the Doctor having a perfect power of vocal mimicry, which maybe, I don't know if we knew that before. It does feel it feels like a bit of a non sequitur, if I'm honest. The fact that, he just had to do a perfect impression of the Toymaker's voice, and then that is what made it work.
Yeah, it's not a clever, impressive resolution, even if it is set up. But I do think there's something to, as we've got to know the Toymaker across this story, the two big things we know about him. The first big thing is that he's impotent. He's not as powerful a man as he's given the impression. He's little, like the Colonel. The Colonel talks a lot. He's like, I'm gonna show Stephen what's what, and then when it actually comes to it, can't do anything because he's just a toy. But aside from that, the two things we know about the Toymaker are that, you know, he plays games and cheats, and that he does so through this sort of identity swapping. He dresses up and he makes dolls into people, and there's all this sort of he putting on characters. And so there's something, I think, to the way the Doctor wins in the end, the way he outsmarts him, being the Doctor cheats at his game by dressing up, pretending to be the Toymaker. It's sort of, we've spent these 3 and a bit episodes just doing puzzles, and we're following all the rules, and we're on our best behaviour as the Toymaker is cheating us at every turn. And then you get to the end, and the only thing that can actually save them when it comes to it, because the Toymaker's such a bad loser, is the Doctor giving in and cheating a little bit himself. And cheating in the same way that the Toymaker cheats, by pretending to be him. I think there's something there. Certainly after you spend the whole story watching the Doctor slowly work through this puzzle, and you're sort of going, why are you doing this? Surely there's a way you can cheat this whole thing. And then at the end, of course, cheating it is how they survive. So there's something there.
Yeah, he spends 3 episodes following the rules, you know, to the letter. It gets quite wearisome in the end, so we're almost kind of cheering him on to just, you know, cheat somehow at the end. It struck me, I think, partway through episode 2, there's some sort of moment where, I think it might have been Stephen and Dodo or something, or it might have been the Toymaker who says it. The idea is suggested that the Toymaker could send a fake Doctor to Stephen and Dodo to trick them, and that doesn't actually happen, but I think the idea is posed, and that struck me as kind of potentially foreshadowing of the, maybe a reverse foreshadowing of the voice mimicry, ultimately. The idea that the Toymaker could imitate the Doctor, like, perfectly and convincingly is kind of turned on its head, because we get the Doctor doing the same thing to the Toymaker. So that could, again, have been something that maybe was percolating around a few episodes before it's actually revealed.
Not foreshadowing with the 60th.
Yeah.
Fake Doctor.
One more thing about the meat of the episodes is that, what do you guys think of the moment when, in episode 2, I guess the resolution of the playing cards characters, is we get the King and Queen who are bickering so much, and kind of, at one point, they kind of want to get the other one to sit in the chair and die, rather than do it themselves, but they ultimately choose to go together, like they sit in the chair, and they say, well, if we go, at least we'll die together. You know, they get crushed inside the chair together. And like, what do you guys think of that moment in terms of what it's trying to do and how effective it is? Because it struck me, like, it seems like an oddly sweet sort of beat, but also, you know, nonetheless, kind of hampered by the fact that the characters aren't particularly treated with much sincerity. They are just joke characters, really. But also this strangely serious beat of them, like, committing, I guess, a mutual, like, joint suicide almost, knowing that they will probably be reduced back to, like, inanimate objects by this. So and doing it, like, almost not for any real goal other than that, like, they don't want to be, I guess, apart from each other. Like, what do you guys think of that moment?
Stirring.
Together or not at all?
No, I know what you mean, Gig. Like, yeah, it is an oddly kind of emotional moment. Yeah.
And it's interesting when the story itself isn't. There's no. A way you could have ended this story would be that. A very Doctor Who-y way you could have ended this story was all the toys decide that they've got nothing to lose, but their little plastic chains, and rising up against the Toymaker and taking over the dimension and making it their own space, right? That's how a Doctor Who story might end.
Oh, I'd love that.
And you've got this sort of gesture towards that idea that they work together, and that's how they do it. But then that turns out the story sort of rejects that as an idea, because then they just get morphed into new people. So
it strikes me again in the first episode with the clowns. There's almost something that seems related to that, which is that when the clowns' cheating is kind of uncovered by Stephen and Dodo, and they have to start doing it seriously, and they have to put on an actual blindfold, and they realise that they're probably going to lose, they suddenly stop being like funny and clownish, and they go dead silent. And there's something actually that's, I guess, the creepiest bit of them is when they suddenly go quiet and they're not having fun anymore. Nobody's laughing anymore. They're just doing it they become incredibly solemn after spending the whole episode clowning around. So it seems like the moments where these distraction characters are shown to have feelings, I guess, is the moment that they're interesting. But we don't really get that in episodes 3 or 4, I think, because we don't really get that with Cyril in the final episode. He just blows himself up quite abruptly. And I don't even remember what happens with Sergeant Rugg and Mrs. Wiggs. They just sort of like drop out with the narrative, I think. Or there's something like that. They end up stuck in the dancing loop, don't they?
Yeah, I suppose they sort of, they're bickering over a pie or whatever. This story. They're bickering over a pie. But then Dodo and Stephen convince them to forgive each other. So there's an element of the same thing there, I suppose, of stopping fighting each other and working together. But whether the toys stand in for the Toymaker as you know, characters of authority in this world, or whether they are other people trapped here. Again, the story raises the question, but then doesn't really find an answer to it. I don't find. So, you know, it's not super clear whether we're meant to read them as extensions of the Toymaker or as other victims of the trap. Cyril's definitely an extension of the Toymaker, but the other two, I don't know.
Something else about the strange rules of the world that they're in. I mean, you know that bit with the freezing chair, where Dodo is kind of stuck in the chair and she's like, oh my god, I'm freezing, I'm turning to ice. And then Stephen's like, no, you must fight it, Dodo. You must psychologically overcome the freezing chair. And kind of that implicit acknowledgement that she's not actually freezing. It's just, I guess, some kind of psychic vibe that you can overcome with enough concentration. And that almost seems similar to, I guess, the whole... Well, there's something similar suggested with the dancing floor, I think. Like, oh, we must stop dancing, we must fight through it. Yeah, there's this whole thing of, like, how powerful actually is, I guess, the Toymaker in terms of what he actually does to people. Because I don't know, there just seems to be something a bit vague there about whether the Toymaker can really do things to people, or whether the Toymaker is just sort of, I guess, just influences rather than directly controls. If you see what I mean?
For what it's worth, I think that's more interesting than an all-powerful god enemy. A guy who has a box of tricks up his sleeve, and, you know, he can influence your behaviour a bit, and he's built some crap saw traps. Dodo's lucky she didn't sit in one of the chairs that fires spikes at your head. There's no way of psychologying your way out of a scissor trap, is there? Fortunately, she sat in the one that you can think your way out of. But yeah, I don't mind the Toymaker being a bit actually useless. I think that's one of the interesting things. And I wonder how much the giggle is going to play into that idea. Versus, you know, you've got stuff about making people dance in this one, which obviously there's a bit of a connection to there.
I guess while we're talking about the Toymaker, what do you guys think of Michael Gough's performance as the Toymaker in these 4 episodes? Because he seems to be quite celebrated now, I guess, in terms of the whole Toymaker revisitation. I think RTD has been kind of talking him up a lot. And I think, certainly of the bits that survive of this story, the Toymaker's, I guess, hectoring of the Doctor and the characters seems to be like one of those... Well, I guess that's basically all there is, really, to actually go off, because that's all he really does in the story. Do you think he does, a particularly memorable job?
Not really. I mean, there's nothing to work with. It's the Toymaker's not an interesting guy. And he's also not... At least in this iteration of the character, he's not so big that he can be interesting the other way. So inhuman he's interesting. He's just a guy, and again, I think that works to the story's benefit. But I wasn't stunned by the performance at all, which isn't Michael Gough's fault,
It's fun to have huge actors in the show. Sometimes that's all you need.
Yeah, and I think it's also fun for those huge actors to just be villainy, even if they're not interesting. You can tell they're having fun, just shouting like, move, go to move, whatever, and for, Doctor, you will die and be here forever. Yeah, even though it's incredibly two-dimensional, I think you can see an actor sort of enjoying the opportunity to be imperious, even if that's like all there really is. And he pulls good facial expressions.
Yeah.
Exactly, when the Doctor gets him at the very end, and he pulls this ridiculous face. That's great.
Yeah.
That's what I want. properly impressive actors with esteem and prestige coming into the show and going, that's what Doctor Who's about.
Did you like the music?
Actually, there was one bit of music that I genuinely enjoyed. I think, sort of start of episode 3, I guess sort of around that cliffhanger and around that resolution of the cliffhanger, when the ballerinas are kind of advancing on Stephen and Dodo, there's this theme that comes in which I actually liked. I don't know if it comes in anywhere else, but that was a good little song there. I wouldn't say I remember anything else from that serial, but there was an occasional bit of good music.
It's a shame the ballerina dance sequence is lost. I imagine that would have done a lot of work to elevate the rest of the episode, because I like a good TV budget ballet.
Watching that on the recon is a little bit cold.
Yeah, I think the recon, the loose cannon version, does its best to kind of recreate
It tries.
kind of visuals and kind of mix things together. It's genuinely creative in some places. There's a lot of effort that's been put in there. But yeah, again, it's not quite the same. I think there's something similar about the clowns as well. I think if you could see the clown stuff and the rest of the physical comedy in inverted commas the clowns are doing, I think that episode would probably feel very different as well. Because those are very physical characters who are constantly flopping around and doing all kinds of things. There's a moment when Dodo is kind of like haranguing the female clown, and she turns into a rag doll in Dodo's hands. That sounds very evocative. I would have loved to see a clip of that.
I did like when the Toymaker fast forwards the trilogic game, and we just sort of cut between positions, instead of the pieces moving most of the time, it's just click, 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 click. I liked the way that looked. I thought that was cool.
Yeah, it's a good visual. I don't know if it's good enough to repeat 4 times in every single episode, but it is good in itself.
No.
Yeah, it has that fun kind of clicky, not really stop motion in any sense that makes sense, but that kind of classic effect, yeah, you can see why that was fun to do.
And I like the implication at the end of this episode that the boiled sweet was, the Toymaker's last punishment on the Doctor. The Doctor goes, what tricks does he have in store in these sweets? Then he eats one and breaks his tooth. And obviously the Toymaker's not done anything to do that, but that sort of sums up how effective he's been the whole story. Is the most damage he causes to any character is by accidentally having the Doctor break a tooth eating a sweet. So that's good. I like that. That's
completely unforced error on the Doctor's part. Eating these sweets. He does not need to eat for any reason.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's quite literally the most harm the Toymaker causes to any of the main characters. That has lasting consequences for the next story.
Yeah.
And it was entirely by accident. Good fun.
Anything else to suck out of the episodes on their own before going into why they are like this?
I guess they wear being a Dr. Light story on their sleeve in a way that is not good. I'm glad the concept of a Dr. Light episode got fixed many years later. You can actually do it properly, because just feeling the absence of Hartnell through the story, just, oh god, I think it really, I don't want to say it's what kills the story dead, but it's just so frustrating. Like, having the Doctor in these scenes as just a hand, just doing the same thing. It's like, oh god, like you want the actual character back. It's so ridiculous watching like Michael Gough like act to nothing. And just, yeah, oh, I see you have lost your voice. But your hand is moving in a way that I think is impudent. Yeah, just the villain acting to nothing. I think is quite frustrating structure for a story.
When Hartnell does turn back up on the other side, it is a huge sigh of relief.
Yeah.
Oh, thank God the Doctor.
Yeah.
The Doctor's in the story again. It's watchable. That's a testament to how engaging he is as a screen presence.
Oh, he's so good. You can't overstate how just the life he brings to his serials. He has that magic factor as well that some of the best Doctors do, that when Hartnell's in a bad story, him just Hartnelling around kind of makes it work, which is why this is kind of the worst case scenario, which is you have a Doctor Who story where you don't even have the Doctor around to kind of gurn or, you know, titter and just kind of make things a little bit enjoyable. You've just taken him out completely. Yeah, it's not a very workable way for the show to function. Which I guess leads into what I want to talk about. Are we ready to talk about why the episodes are this way?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
The show in the modern run is spearheaded by, well, one man most of the time, sometimes two other men, but basically one figure who kind of does both the head writer job and the kind of lead exec producer job. There are other very important producers around, you know, in different eras of the show, and those different producers colour the eras in different ways, but modern Doctor Who is very much led by kind of a sole figure in a lot of ways. Of course, Russell T Davies, then Stephen Moffat, then Chris Chibnall, then Russell T Davies again. The classic show didn't work that way at all. It had writers and producers were more kind of split up in terms of how that functioned. And so the way the classic show often gets grouped is by looking at the pairings of kind of the head producer and the equivalent of the head writer or the script editor. So the show started off in really good hands with the incredible, the fantastic, the magnificent David Whittaker, and of course the great Verity Lambert as well. And they ran, well, of course, Unearthly Child kind of came out of a lot of different states, so that one's a bit weird to include in some ways, I guess. But basically the start of the show through Dark Invasion of Earth, Season 2, Serial 2, was Verity and David Whittaker. Great run. I love that run. And then it was Verity and Dennis Spooner from The Rescue through The Chase, so through the most of Season 2. Then it was Verity and Donald Tosh for the Time Meddler at the end of Season 2, up through Mission to the Unknown early on in Season 3. And then we moved into the post-Verity era, which was a bit of a, I don't know if vacuum is the right word, but some stability left the show at that point. We had John Wiles and Donald Tosh, who did the Mythmakers through the arc, so that's Season 3, the third serial through the sixth serial. Then we had Innes Lloyd and Jerry Davis, who started with this, really, the Celestial Toymaker. So Season 3, Serial 7, up through The Evil of the Daleks, Season 4, Episode 9. So you can see we're kind of in a liminal place here, the Celestial Toymaker. This is coming at the start of one kind of era, one kind of partnership. But of course, things at the start came from the previous era. So we've got a kind of script that's happened for one reason and it's getting kind of produced by the next team, which is the cause of some of its issues, but there are so many issues in this serial, so there's a lot of causes. The script is written by Brian Hales. Well, the scripts are written by Brian Hales, who is the man who made the Ice Warriors. So it's his name credited on all the scripts, but that's, as we know from, I mean, not just New Who, from the show in general, the name on the script isn't always the name that made most of the story, is it?
No.
So Brian Hales, his submission was very popular with John Wiles and Donald Tosh, who were the team before the Celestial Toymaker, because that team had grown irritated or tired of producing scripts that came before they kind of started on the show, and The idea of doing a very left field story like the Celestial Toymaker was appealing. You know, this is a very different sort of story than the show had done before, or has even done since, really. The original conception of this serial was a psychological horror play. It's a fantasy dimension, it's got horror elements, it's going to be a really majestic, fascinating, strange deal, which is going to have a character that could be from the Doctor's own race. That was part of the original conception, like the monk. So I know a lot of the extended universe has ran with that as well, although some of it has done something different with the Toymaker. So the script for the Toymaker got submitted, the first script, and back then it was being called the Trilogic Game. And in that script was something I think Oliver knows a bit about. There were two characters called George and Margaret, and this is this is where it gets really complicated and confusing and strange, and the reason this serial is so weird and bad in so many ways emerges. Do either of you, well, I guess Oliver, can you explain what George and Margaret is?
I can certainly try. So George and Margaret was a 1930s play. It's a sort of British dinner time comedy drama. Not quite fast, but in that ballpark. By Gerald Savory.
Yeah.
Savory, like dinner. I'm not familiar with it. But the premise of George and Margaret is it's set over a bunch of dinners, and it's a bunch of characters talking about their dinner guests, George and Margaret, but George and Margaret aren't there. So it's a lot of waiting for them to arrive, chatting about what kind of people George and Margaret are, the drama that comes up from their absence. It's sort of like I've seen it compared to Waiting for Godot, where it's about the characters who aren't in the story, and it's about waiting for them to turn up.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that the original version of the Celestial Toymaker was meant to be starring George and Margaret, that Joey and Clara / all the other characters that those two actors play would have been George and Margaret from the play George and Margaret, famous for not being in that play.
The thing that's weird enough on its own. The truly weird thing about that, though, is the person who was the head, who had just taken over, who had become BBC's head of television drama serials in 1965, taking over from Donald Wilson, was Gerald Savoy. So was the writer of George and Margaret. But the Celestial Toymaker, or the Trilogic Game serial having George and Margaret in it, didn't come from him. That was like from the writer and from Donald Tosh. So that was the idea, was like, our new boss will be flattered by us putting his characters in it that aren't actually in his...
And then he vetoed it, right?
Yeah, would you, if you'd gotten these scripts with your characters who aren't in your actual story, and that's kind of the point, and the characters were written in this way, but it'd be an extremely bizarre situation to be in, and I don't think you'd be that happy.
I think my understanding is that they initially thought they had his permission, but then just before they went into production, he was like, "Okay, no, I'm taking away my permission. You're not doing this." So it's like it went back and forth, basically. So maybe like at some stage he was allowing it, and then at another stage he stopped. At least that's what it says on Shannon Sullivan, at least.
I think it might have been to do with when he actually read the scripts, is my impression.
Yeah, probably.
I do think there's something really rich about the Toymaker's weird space outside of regular, outside of the rules of regular drama, is the place where characters who aren't in plays go. Like the idea that George and Margaret are outside of the bounds of the play George and Margaret, so therefore they have to be somewhere, and this is the place that they are. That's sort of neat, and more mind robbery than the rest of the story is. But I don't see how it would tie with any of the game playing stuff or anything like that. Yeah.
There's so much weirdness with how this developed. So with whether the head of drama serials approved or not of it, there's some differing accounts there. But basically, like Gig said, at one stage it seemed okay, and then at one stage it became clear it was not okay. But the idea for putting George and Margaret in the serial was from the actual writer, Brian Hales, and then other people were happy with how that was working. But then the tonal issues started appearing. So, first it was going to be more of a psychological horror type thing. Then John Wiles got a bit scamped about how dark are we going. This is still Doctor Who, this is a family show. And then we kind of got a Toymaker-esque merry-go-round or musical chairs situation where certain people weren't in the room when things needed to happen. And so things kept getting shuffled off onto other people. So Brian Hales, the actual writer himself, was busy with other work. So he couldn't do the rewrites needed to fix certain elements, especially to do with the budget. Obviously, this is like an early version of a Dr. Light episode. The arc cost a lot of money, which is part of the reason why this had to cost a lot less money. So issues with the tone cropped up. Issues with the budget were cropping up. Donald Tosh was going to be the one who would fix the story. Fix is the word. Is it the word for it? He was going to be the one to change the story. And the idea then was the credit would be written by Donald Tosh based on an idea by Brian Hales. That's not how everything ended up working out with the credit or the episodes. But anyway, Donald Tosh started changing things. Planned scenes inside a maze got abandoned. The trilogic game got included for the Doctor against the Toymaker. The trilogic game, that kind of comes from the Tower of Hanoi game, which was, despite the name and the vibe, from a French mathematician from 1883. And around here was the idea to have the Toymaker dressed up as... how to describe? The camera script describes it as a happy-looking Occidental Mandarin character. He's dressed in a splendid-looking bejeweled floor-length coat. We'll come back to that later. I don't think it's... We'll get into that later. The thing with the Doctor being absent in the middle episodes was around for a long time, even before, shifts in the story and whatnot. But the really interesting thing with that is, and I know fans do tend to know this a lot of the time, this isn't like a totally mind-blowing revelation, but the idea to have Hartnell leave the show is kind of from here. This was an early kind of go at that idea. William Hartnell getting increasingly sick, issues with the new production team now that Verity's gone and different people are running it. News stories about what's Hartnell doing. Is he going to stick around? Is he not going to stick around? The idea of switching actor for the Doctor had started to bubble up, basically. And so one of the very early permutations of that idea was, in this serial, can we have in the last episode a different actor be the Doctor? And Stephen and Dodo were like, ooh, is this happening because of the events of the story? The serial starts with them, they're saying, hey, with the events of the preceding story to do with why this is happening now. Is it a trick of the Toymakers? Is it the magic of the Toymaker? One way or another, can we use this story to transform Hartnell into a man we can continue the show on with for further years? Hartnell's contract was due to expire during this serial. It ended up getting renewed, and so things obviously panned out differently. But Hartnell had a holiday in the middle, one way or another, and so he wasn't in the middle of it. But it's interesting that we kind of presaged the idea of the 10th planet when we actually do transform the actor here. Did you guys know that?
I didn't know it prior to watching. I think it's kind of crazy. The idea that Hartnell's last story could have been basically his holiday, where he's just a disembodied hand for most of it. It's a deeply disquieting thought, I think. So I think it's one of those doomed timelines that we just narrowly avoided. We really dodged a bullet there, I think.
I was aware of the idea that you would have just had the Doctor disappear and then reappear and then not go into it further. In which case, I wonder if we would have had the Toymaker turn back up every time the Doctor needed to regenerate.
It's a fun idea. Well, is it? It's an interesting idea.
Gets trapped in a new game. Certainly, it's lining up once again.
Ah, yes. The stage we're at right now is really messy. Like Gig says, it's kind of an absurd way to write Hartnell out. The story's kind of falling apart because of the budget and the tonal changes and the whole era of the show and everything. And so in the middle of all this, of course, the team leaves. John Wiles resigns and he works elsewhere. Then Donald Tosh leaves as well. He goes on holiday, actually. And so we get a new team running the show, Inez Lloyd and Jerry Davis, who run it for a while. Imagine entering into running the show with this script, and the script in this state. it's kind of an unenviable position, and I think the issues are becoming more and more clear at this point. Innes Lloyd, interesting guy. Sidney Newman wanted him to board the ship, the ship as it was called back then. Board the ship, and he wasn't really a Doctor Who guy. He wasn't a sci-fi guy, but he liked real science, and he worked well with Jerry Davis, and he had issues with Hartnell, but hey, everything came together, and we got some good stories out of that run. The Celestial Toymaker, one of them, probably not. Everyone's on holiday or leaving, and the scripts are getting kind of floated around at this stage. Donald Tosh sends in his rewritten versions of Brian Hales' story to Brian Hales, and he says that now John Wiles is going to be handling it. And so they start removing the maze that had been in the original version because it would be too expensive, and we get the puzzle that we ended up getting in the Hunt the Key game instead. And Donald Tosh thanked Brian Hales for being so good about letting him, quote, massacre his scripts. So there's a kind of, I think there's an awareness in the production teams that this story is kind of getting out of control, and maybe not in the good way. This is just my read of the situation. Maybe they really thought they had a cracker on their hands, but my impression is when you're getting... I mean, TV was produced very differently in the 60s. Maybe they were much more workmanlike about this than I'm projecting onto them, but my impression is if everyone's kind of finessing this and everyone's kind of leaving and everyone's kind of moving and everyone's kind of holidaying, would you think there's kind of awareness that this probably isn't going to end up anyone's best work?
Certainly by this stage, like at this level of rewrites, it was probably sinking in on some level how this was going to end up turning out. Maybe not quite to the extent that it did turn out, but certainly I think people must have been picking up on it at some point.
Well, the next issue was something you both talked about was, hey, these all run short. These all need to be extended because there's not enough content in these episodes as they stand. One thing Innes Lloyd wanted to do was cast big actors. A kind of Russell T Davies connection there again. And so that's where our Michael Gough element came in, who, yeah, I mean, imagine the serial without him. It's even more an issue then, I suppose, isn't it? Anyway, very shortly before production begins, the head of drama serials changes his mind and says, you know what, I'm not that happy with what's going on here. And so permission for George and Margaret is removed. The scripts need transforming once again. What do we do with the scripts? The issue was George and Margaret were already cast at this stage. Everything was so ready to go in production. And so they get transformed into the myriad of characters that they play because they were quite good actors that had been hired to do this. And so that's what happened there. Jerry Davis had been given full permission to rewrite everything by the boss to make everything work. They had to use the sets that had already been designed and built. So we've gone through how many versions of the story at this stage, and everything keeps getting transformed and transformed. To quote the complete history, the new versions of the Celestial Toymaker scripts were rewritten at the rate of one each day, with Davis writing in the garden of his newly purchased bungalow, and generally replaced the George and Margaret pairing with other duos, as we've seen throughout the episodes. The rewrites did not go down well with either Donald Tosh or John Wiles. Tosh was horrified to find that the changes had been made by Davis on his return from honeymoon shortly before he left. Wiles strongly disagreed with the playing down of the battle of wits between the Doctor and the Toymaker, which was now totally secondary to the games played by Dodo and Stephen. On Friday, 25th of February, while sending the rewrites of Doctor Who and the Toymaker to Savoy, Wiles complained that Tosh's original scripts had been pieces of great menace, and that money had been wasted on the rewrites that did not do justice to the work of both Hales and Tosh. Hales did, however, later tell Davis that he had been happy with the finished results. And that's kind of the story of the pre-production, which, how can you sum up that whole story in a couple of words or a sentence? How would you guys characterize that whole tale?
Clusterfuck?
Good God.
Yeah. And I guess watching the episodes, the thinness of them kind of makes sense to me now when it's kind of is it butter scraped over too much bread? Is it kind of that Capaldi 12th Doctor-esque, how long have I been doing this? How long can I keep regenerating? How long can I keep scraping out a new version of myself? I think there's a word for it. It's like they've been diminished again and again. It's like a simulacrum kind of copy of a copy of a copy thing. I feel like these scripts had been through the grinder so much, and kind of the whole point of them had been removed. Like they were meant to be a psychological drama, and that got removed. They were meant to be this bizarre, probably misguided intertextuality thing, and that got removed. They were meant to be good, I guess, and somewhere in the process that got removed.
That got removed.
I hate when I get that note.
It's a wonder that they came out as... It's a wonder that they came out not as good as they did, but that they came out at all, I guess. I guess when you're an incoming team, I suppose it's kind of like when we discussed an Unearthly Child. My impression was no one was really enormously happy that that was the serial they were producing first, but there's a point when you're coming in, you just need to produce kind of what scripts are around to get something on air at all. And I guess that was a situation Innes Lloyd and Jerry Davis were in here. At least they kind of carved it up with some of the later stories they did with Hartnell, but man, this sounded difficult to put together. Especially because they had a small budget as well.
The budget obviously impacts the actual real makeability of the thing hugely. But it does seem to me that it's the scripts getting carved up again and again, and probably not being stellar to begin with. I've not read the original scripts, but to take an idea that's already not at its best and then carve out sections and redraft it through several different writers, that's the killer for this story, I think. It loses any sense of drama, really. There's very little of that in the story.
It's fascinating that in taking two characters who I guess would have been consistent throughout the story and replacing them with three different duos, I guess, like turning two characters into six, it both complicates the story and also reduces those characters to being, pretty much trivial distractions who don't really get to exist much outside their individual sketch and just get dispatched so the next set of characters can come in. Like it's a more complicated job for the actors who are cast to play these two characters, now have to play like multi-role as like a variety of panto roles. But nonetheless, it also makes the story like simpler and stupider in some ways.
Our reactions are pretty plain to this story, and I know Oliver especially has talked a bit about some ways fandom has consumed this story over the decades. It's really interesting to see the contemporary response to this story. The day on which the dancing floor was broadcast, the Daily Mirror had a letter from a viewer which read, "The atmosphere of terror, sadism and wickedness of Doctor Who makes it the most psychologically mixed up show on TV. I shudder to think what its effect is on sensitive children. It should be screened at 10:50 p.m, not 5:50 p.m. For the game itself, the trilogic game, a letter to the Radio Times on the 21st of April told of a replica made by one viewer. But more interestingly than that, on BBC One's Junior Points of View on 29th of April, the host, Sarah Ward, presented correspondence on the subject from younger viewers. And one said, "I found the puzzle very simple indeed, and I was able to complete it in a total of 25 minutes. While another said, "Is Doctor Who meant to have superhuman intelligence? If so, why, when faced with a trilogic game, did he stagger back in amazement?" And another said of the ending, "I think it is silly the way a person of Doctor Who's intelligence should eat a sweet given him by an enemy he might have known it would be poisonous."
Oh dear, if only it was poisonous.
Yeah, so reception seemed mixed in the contemporary sense.
The dual thing of the trilogic game being incredibly big and complicated and extremely, extremely simple. Not in the sort of subtle way that a riddle might be simple and yet complex, but sort of the other way around. Solving the trilogic game is sort of very simple, but it takes a lot of time and it's very complicated to do. That makes for no drama whatsoever, especially for a child audience.
So in fandom for decades, the story was kind of, like we've talked about, epicified. I think Oliver didn't quite put it in those terms, but it was kind of reimagined as an epic in ways It maybe wasn't originally, not even in terms of a failure. I'm not saying the story failed to be epic. I'm saying I don't think the story was tonally trying to be an epic exactly. It got kind of imagined by fans across decades. I think in general, missing episodes tend to get imagined as just bigger in general, or like of a grander scale, or like of more epic import. I'm not totally sure why we do this actually, but it is a thing that tends to get done. And then it's so fascinating if a serial gets recovered. The kind of puncturing and reassessment is so fabulous. It's one of the best things about recovery of serials. Hopefully we live to see it happen again with the story one day. Anyway, would you guys agree with how I'm characterizing the Toymaker over the years there?
Yeah, I would say so. Like, clearly, I think as much as sometimes people might like to pretend with kind of old stories that have a bad reputation that, oh, well, it was a different time, like this was just what TV was like back then. Like, that's not true in this case. Like, even people back when this aired were saying this was shit, right? You know, the BBC's audience research report on the story, the sample of viewers that they talked to were like, this is ridiculous, this is rubbish. Some of them said like, well, my kids enjoyed it, but I thought it was kind of shit. And I can see how, like, maybe for kids kind of being traumatized by this strange man and this demonic game show happening every week, I can see how that would leave a really lasting impression. But like, nonetheless, I think, this airs a year before The Prisoner starts. Like, but in terms of where TV is at as a medium, this is so far behind that this is not reflective of like what TV was truly like. Really, this is just this is a flop. So it is ahistorical, I think, for fans to kind of try and put more on this serial than it really is or than it really deserves.
Another current of fandom reception to the story, and I mean not just fandom, audience in general, has of course been the racial element of it, which is how the title gets received by a lot of people. Obviously, the Toymaker, like we said from the camera script, is dressed as, a Mandarin, an occidental Mandarin, which is interesting phrasing. That evolved as well. From our vantage point in the 2020s, people might draw this back more to the About Time books and other cultural criticism of the serial, talking straightforwardly about racist impulses in the storytelling and whatnot. And I mean, whatever you want to say about the Toymaker himself and his clothes, there's one kind of unquestionably racist part of the story, which the soundtrack papers over, which is, of course, a slur that's said by one of the characters, which I get, maybe fans are less aware of this now because it does kind of get removed by how the story gets presented now in whatever form you're watching it in.
Yeah, I was quite fascinated, actually. I was watching through the whole thing wondering, like, when is the slur going to happen? When is it? And I got to the end and it hadn't happened. So I was like, wait, where was it? It was only when I went back and I noticed they conveniently mixed Peter Purves' narration right over it. So it's just really, it's in there. You can hear it. We have to listen really close. Yeah. I think there's something quite funny about that, just covertly covering up, like, the quite, like, grotesque racism of our classic serials right there. So, it's very interesting to be in that position of having to try and be the one mixing out the dangerous content.
I think the most interesting vantage point from which to discuss the story's racism and racial discussions of the story is a relatively recent article. Well, it's kind of, the article's gone through a series of versions from the writer James Curray Smith, who's a British writer who's done a lot of interesting stuff in Doctor Who alone. He's written a lot on Doctor Who and for Doctor Who. He's had an article that he's had in a couple of different forms. It was originally, I think, on the Hero Collector website, so it was kind of paired with the release of the Toymaker, what do you call those, like toys, like figures. And then it's lived on in different versions on his own, like Substack website, where he kind of he says a kind of production history of the story, and then he proposes a alternate reading of it in terms of racism, which I've seen kind of spur up some discussions which agree with them, some discussions which disagree with them, but all the discussions are a little bit more interesting than the regular Toymaker discussions, I think, for interacting with his reading one way or another. I don't know if either of you guys have read what he's written before on this serial.
I haven't delved into his piece. I was aware it existed. Well, I became aware today, but I haven't read it.
I read it, I guess, when it came out, and then again last night, just to freshen up. I suppose actually I read it before watching the story, that means.
Yeah.
So that's more so my experience with it than actually watching the episode.
to kind of zip through it, he gives the production history similar to we talked through from the Complete History book, talking about, how the different scripts came across and, why that happened and why it was such a kind of shambolic affair in some ways. The interesting history with George and Margaret. And then he says this is quite interesting. It's worth quoting this bit outright. When he's talking of the Tatwood Lawrence Miles books, he says, "Since that About Time essay, it's become routine to declare that said Toymaker is an inherently problematic figure, that dressing white actor Michael Gough in the robes of a Mandarin represents the series invoking a yellow peril villain like Fu Manchu. Some commentators state outright that Gough is in racist yellowface makeup to appear Chinese, or that he adopts a vocal tone as the character which suggests the accent of a person of East Asian heritage speaking English as a second language." Then he does some script archaeology and he talks about the meaning of the word occidental, and he's saying, because in the camera script it says occidental Mandarin, that's not like, it's not just saying like a Mandarin. He's kind of pointing out that in his view it has to be a form of juxtaposition, right? Occidental, West, Western, Western Mandarin, Western Eastern. There's a kind of tension in the scripting of, how he's dressed there, right? And that we've got kind of a split there, which he digs a lot into. How do you guys see the camera script's description there, Occidental Mandarin? What would you pull out of that?
I think it complies with, I guess, what the story is kind of visually doing there, which is that we're taking the vibes of someone dressing like an East Asian sort of figure, and we're just plopping it onto our character to create the sense of disjointedness and also make him seem spacey in a way that is Orientalist, but is like, it's not as, it's a specific type of racism. It's not necessarily like a straight up simplistic, like, this is a yellow-faced character kind of racism. This is kind of more, I think that description of the Occidental Mandarin, it suggests that he is like, this is someone cosplaying, but nonetheless, like, that sense of cosplay is nonetheless, that has been inserted by, like, the creators of the story because they want to give him a particular, like, visual aesthetic, a particular vibe, for this spacey, like, cosmic tyrant sort of character. So, I think that I don't think this is leading to some kind of incredibly clever, subversive critique of how, actually, it's the Toymaker who is racist. You can't call the story racist, it's just the Toymaker. Like, no. Not like that.
I think a good point he makes in this essay, though, is to point out, and I think this kind of gets lost in the swirl of Classic Who sometimes, as he points out, Classic Who's racist a lot. 9 weeks earlier, to quote the essay, 9 weeks earlier, Kevin Stoney was appearing in Doctor Who in yellowface makeup. And if you consider that a marginal case, the script specifies that Mavic Chen, a man from 4000 AD, is from a human ethnic group that does not yet exist, then there are numerous examples of it in Marco Polo less than 2 years before. And then he points out that, of course, in 11 years' time, we get Talons, and so there's blatant yellowface there. Basically, it wouldn't have been weird for the Celestial Toymaker serial to do yellowface in the sense that Doctor Who had done it before and it was going to do it again. So the fact it didn't do it, he says, is worth unpacking there. And then he picks some holes in the whole use of the word celestial, and he tries to do some diving of, in American English, it's used one way, in British English, it's used another way. How are they using it here? How many times is it used in the script? He kind of does a lot of that, which I think, no, I don't think that's that interesting. I think he's stretching it a bit there. I think when he's splitting hairs about racism, you're kind of losing an argument in a way, but
I think even outside the actual phrasing of that script line, I think every other element of the story is very, very British. All the characters the Toymaker creates are, British kings and queens and very British coded, and the colonel and the housemaid are very, very British, and the play it's sort of, it was adapting or pseudo adapting and has forgotten to adapt, is one of those very concerned with British sensibilities. There's everything about the Toymaker's world, apart from the clothes and the trilogy game, which I'm sure we'll get to in a moment. Everything about them are very, very British, which to me really does support James Corey Smith's point there, that he's meant to be read as a British man who is also wearing, like you say, cosplay.
Like you alluded to, Oliver, just then, in a 90s interview, Donald Tosh said the trilogic game was ancient Chinese, which was why the Toymaker was dressed like a Chinese Mandarin. And so James Cray Smith is drawing, links to the trilogic game, Toymaker, this kind of Chinese but not Chinese on purpose thing is kind of swirling around. And then the reading, of course, he's building to here is that the Toymaker is an appropriator. He's appropriating the game. He's appropriating his clothes. That James Cray Smith says this is the root of the occidental description. There's like there's an intentional juxtaposition in the script. There's an intentional juxtaposition in the visuals. The whole thing is kind of predicated on this juxtaposition that is like he's a figure using the artifacts and the materials of another culture, and that's his kind of that's who he is. That's kind of the point. And then he kind of draws that through the whole script, and I think this is where he probably loses gig, where he's saying, so if you go through the George and Margaret characters, we've got the use of the slur there, we've got all the very Britishness of the Iron Duke stuff and all the soldiers never apologize, and all those kind of interactions. Of course, you've got King Henry playing cards. We've got the "we're not amused" line. We've got all this. James Cray Smith saying there's all this British monarchy stuff basically floating around, and then you've got all the appropriating stuff with the Toymaker. 1 + 1 = 2. We're doing a story about appropriation, colonization, all this kind of thing. It all links together thematically. Is kind of the reading he's stitching together.
This is Stephen and Dodo versus the British Empire. Is what you're saying?
Yeah.
What about the clowns? How does that explain the clowns?
Well, have you seen our government recently? Tish.
Victorian iconography, I think, is where he's getting like the dollhouse. Is there's Victorian imagery there. I don't know if clowns are linked to Victoriana at all. Maybe I'm not a clown guy. A clown followed me once when I was a kid, and I've never liked them since. So I can't really get into that.
Sorry, what?
Yeah.
What?
He was fine. It was just a weird situation.
What?
I got away. It's fine. Anyway, I don't know where clowns come from. Evidently, I don't know if they're actually associated with Victoriana. Gig, do you know anything about that?
I'm not familiar with any sort of clown Victoriana secret connection there.
Yeah, but
what?
So what James Cray Smith is saying is, why isn't the Toymaker dressed up as a fox hunter or like an English judge if we're doing all this English stuff? Well, because the real English thing here is to plunder other civilizations. It's to dress himself in the robes of another civilization and have artifacts from another civilization, to do the whole British Museum type thing. That's the true British thing. And so the fact that Donald Tosh is wrong about where the trilogic game comes from, like I said earlier, how it's actually from a French mathematician, look at that. It's, look how things come together there. Appropriation is what's going on here. And so that's what the Toymaker represents, and that's the nature of his juxtaposition, and that's how we link through the threads of the George and Margaret XP characters. That's how everything goes together. If you look at George and Margaret scripts themselves, you've got lines about how George and Margaret spend their lives out in the British Empire and talk about it all the time. So there's connections, there's intertextual connections there. Link.
I think a lot of the argument here is actually quite sound. I think a lot of it's quite clever and is definitely linking ideas that do exist in the episode. But I think drawing it into one whole reading that's about appropriation, I'm not sure that's quite in the text. I think appropriation is a part of what I think the story depicts appropriation. I'm not sure appropriation is particularly a thematic concern. What I would suggest is that it's a story about cheating. The people who make the rules being the people who cheat at the games that they create. And I think that's a bit broader, and I think that covers all the different aspects of the story a bit more clearly. And appropriation is a subsection of that, but the story itself doesn't really go into it. We've got no perspective whatsoever on the people who are being appropriated, which really limits the ability of the story to be about appropriation, I find.
Just to represent everything fairly, So the conclusion of James Cray Smith's article is, well, this version of it, the free version of it, is, may we say then that as part of his rewrite, Davis transferred what is unpleasant about George and Margaret to his new characters, retaining that element of colonial critique by making them archetypes that would reinforce that theme. I think we may. This is, after all, the same Jerry Davis who returned to 60s London from Canada because he disliked life in, quote, a little outpost of empire. The Celestial Toymaker anticipates the Victorian aesthetic craze of post-swinging London by a matter of months, a fine distinction that is easy to miss after nearly 60 years, but there is no fondness for the era of the Queen Empress on display here. It is something to be feared, escaped, and with luck even destroyed. But as the Doctor insists in the story's final scenes, the evil that the Toymaker represents always exists and must be guarded against because otherwise it will return. That's basically how it concludes. And also, I'm skipping through bits of it as I recapped it there, not to mock it or anything. I'm not mocking the article at all, just because it's a long article, and if you're interested, you should go read it yourself, rather than just hear me paraphrase it. Of course, it's linked here and everything. Gig, how are you going to respond to all this?
Well, what I was just going to say before is that that detail of what you said earlier about like how Donald Tosh was wrong about the origin of the Trilogic game. I think that sense of being wrong, like it's not just a sense of like a silly like it's not like he just forgot or something like that. This is the case of this is essentially the reframing of the game as being from East Asia was a deliberate lie, basically created to sell it, by its French creator. Yeah, so and this is a case of like the fashionable Orientalism of it being part and parcel of the product, and that was swallowed wholesale by like audiences receiving it in the West, even by people like Tosh, I guess. So it's not like a neutral thing. Just be like, oh well, this game is Chinese, so the Toymaker will dress Chinese, and like that in itself, in its own way, like repeating and like repackaging and regurgitating something that is already racist into it. And I think Oliver, what you said about like the story like depicting appropriation, I think it's like to a certain extent it's depicting it because it's kind of doing it as well. And if you do something, you're going to inevitably end up depicting it as well. So I think on the whole, I think there is definitely I'm not sort of like super like savaging this article or anything that you might be expecting, because I think the whole thing of the story is definitely doing a thing about how these toys and dolls and the sort of pseudo-Victorianism that's surrounding them is kind of creepy. I think it's kind of weird and alienating. And that is definitely like a deliberate aspect of these characters. They're kind of even the thing we were talking about earlier about how the characters are kind of treated a bit dismissively, or like they're sort of flat cardboard cutouts rather than real human beings. That again, that feels like it's drawn from, I guess, if anything, a sense that these archetypes are superficial. That these archetypes are kind of dehumanizing almost. Like there is like an aesthetic sense underpinning this story. I probably wouldn't go so far as to say that it's like a terribly clever, like a thing like the Toymaker represents the British Empire, but I would say the skepticism is there, and that is understandable and sympathetic. I would just say that I still think ultimately the Toymaker is dressed like that because they thought it would look cool. I think that I can't really see a deeper meaning to it than that, if I'm honest.
Oliver, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't disagree. I do think I'm more willing, I think, to draw connections between the Toymaker and the Empire, especially with Cyril. I think that's the British public schooling seems to be a big theme with everyone who went to British public school.
Important thing about Cyril, he was overtly based on this character called like Billy Bunter, who was like a sort of quite recognisable kind of long-running character in these like I can't remember if it was like books first or cartoons first. I mean, he would have been in TV comic or something like that around this time period, I think. Like he was like a long-running kind of, he was a figure. And he got to the point where the owners of the rights to that character were kind of like, excuse me, when it was there, like, is this, are you impugning our precious character here? What is this? So they had to add a clarification when the final episode aired. Like, this is totally different character, guys. It's not him. So it's not just like the vague idea of a public schoolboy. It's also openly like, okay, this is an actual specific idea that we're kind of riffing on here. But yeah, please go on, absolutely.
There's that not what's the one on the island with the kids and the pig and the
Lord of the Flies.
Not pig, he's a boy. Lord of the Flies. There's that big statement piece, Lord of the Flies kind of theme that runs through so much of of 20th century and slightly earlier British fiction that something happens in posh British schools that breaks young men's brains and makes them just evil. And that's a big theme that I see a lot of, and I've not got any experience with that, but people who have been to public school, lots of them seem to have observed that that's something that happens. And it does seem to me that the episode makes a very big deal of ending with the public schoolboy, and he's the most obvious cheat, and he's the equally the most impotent and the most deadly at the same time, and that seems to link to the Toymaker to me. I read the episode as drawing a connection between Cyril and the Toymaker, even if there's not more of a British Empire explicit message. I think there's definitely a connection between Cyril and the Toymaker, suggesting they are the same kind of person. They're posh kids who are bad losers. But, the Toymaker says, "I'm a bad loser." He's a kid. He's exactly the same as Cyril. There's a connection there, even if that doesn't pan out into a broader condemnation of the British Empire. Although I think you can read some of that into it, however intentional it is.
Yeah, I think Cyril is a direct proxy for the Toymaker in the way that the duos in the earlier episodes aren't. Certainly, they don't really try to play up Cyril as a servant or a prisoner of the Toymaker. He's just a malevolent...
a little shit.
Yeah, a little shit, basically. I love how the cliffhanger of the penultimate episode is just that Stephen and Dodo now have to confront this little shit. How will they possibly deal with this?
I do hope that the giggle maintains the little shit energy of the Toymaker, because that's what I found most interesting here, is that he's not godlike powerful and impressive and cool. He's a little shit. He's a bit of a piece of crap who's really annoying. I hope there's some element of that maintained, because that seems like the point to me.
The issue with all these readings is the scripts went through so much, I don't know if refinement's the word, change, that you'd think there'd be so much to mine out here between them. But when I watch or listen, or do you watch a recon? What do you call that? When I absorb a recon, it's just so thin, this serial, that I think that's the real juxtaposition to me, is that it feels like there is so much to talk about in trying to dig into, were they attempting this, or is it depicting this or depicting that? But I don't actually feel like there's that much to really dig into in a way. Does that make sense at all? What I'm trying to... I feel like the difficulty of trying to pass what this is doing is that it's not really doing much.
Yeah, I think the trouble with it being a rescue script that someone has rewritten in an attempt to fix it, rather than in an attempt to truly make their own thing. They're just trying to fix something that is blatantly broken and needs to be amended somehow. Is that the creative impulses there maybe aren't necessarily going to be as interesting as if this were a completely original serial by that writer, or even if this was more a personal taste-driven rewrite by, say, a script editor. No, this is someone who has to fix a story that has been fucked by rights issues. And I think the creative results of that, while they can be very interesting, depending on the circumstances, I think in this case it just really, there is a real sense that this is kind of superficially dicking around in a toy box. It's just fitting given the story, and it's not. It really is the bits and pieces here feel too superficial to actually arrive a deeper meaning from.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. The additional writers certainly have a subtracting effect. It doesn't feel like you've got lots of voices singing in harmony and lots of different elements of people who had different takes on the script. It reads like there was a script written by one person, and then for practical reasons 2 other people had to come in and change things until nobody's voice is particularly clear in the final version.
Yeah, it's just been washed and washed and washed, and it's lost some semblance of identity every single time and become more of a broken palimpsest of things that don't really go here.
Good word.
I would have kind of loved to see, or at least read, the version that they were worried about being too dark when Hales was writing it originally. I'm just so fascinated. Like, what about this could have been like too dark for Doctor Who, too like dark for BBC or whatever? That kind of fascinates me. And maybe it would have been boring and shit, but I think someone's attempt to write Doctor Who and they ended up making it like too psychologically terrorizing. That is something that would fascinate me, at least, more than this does.
I think that's not even just a flippant thing. That is kind of a legacy of this serial is, wow, there's some really interesting ideas here. Or there's a potentially really interesting villain here. And that's kind of the seed of it, isn't it? That there's something here that's interesting to think about, but maybe isn't interesting to actually experience in its original form or as close as we can get to it, given most of it's lost.
Yeah, I suppose in a sense, perhaps the efforts to redo the Toymaker by other writers over the years are in their own way trying to get at what this story might have been before the endless rewrites. Yeah, even though they are inspired by obviously the finished product, they're also trying to speak to the vague idea that existed before the finished product and still kind of dimly there in the finished product. Just this quite sinister Toymaker figure. Because he was, even if like the whole battle of wits between him and the Doctor was heavily downplayed over the rewrites, that character was still there from the start. Like this story was about the Toymaker when it was first starting. So yeah, so I think we can see that these efforts are maybe kind of efforts to bring back the original idea of the Toymaker before it got turned into whatever the fuck this is with all the clowns and stuff. The Toymaker feels to me a bit like a sort of like a 60s version of Swarm and Azure, in the sense that you have actor having lots of fun, but really no good lines, really. Like, no good interactions, no good, like, dialogue or characterization. I think you've just got, like, you've got a platform for an actor to be fun, and that's, like, about it, I think. But nonetheless, that can be enough sometimes for a villain to really stick in people's memories. I think you can see how the Toymaker, at least the image of the Toymaker from that original serial, is being so flaunted at the moment in the promotion for like the 60th, like in the like classic Who montages they're doing. They're showing off the Toymaker in his original Mandarin outfit quite a lot. Check out, we colorized this frame of the Toymaker. So I think again that idea, I guess, of the Toymaker is so I think that there is a willingness to play up at least the superficial appeal of him.
And I think part of that is down to the absence, not just the missingness of the episode, but the fact that there's not that much written into the Toymaker to begin with. Like Swarm and Azure, the fact that there's not much to them means there's more room for people to project onto them, right?
Yeah.
You can imagine whatever backstory you like. If a character represents a very specific motivation, if they're clear in their identity, where they come from and what they want, then that's great for drama, but it's not, it's not fertile for creating legacy, right? If something's wrapped in mystery and not very well explained and sort of shrouded with fog, then, there's not much dramatic to it, but it's very fertile for creating a legacy. And that seems to be what's happened here.
Yeah, it's almost like when things really specifically belong in their own story, in the story that they were written into, that limits the extent you can do with them afterwards, because you have to, like, follow up on the contours of that original story. Whereas with something like this, where the Toymaker doesn't really seem to belong in his original story, that kind of gives him an existence outside the story that people are just kind of returning to over and over and over again to try and just do their own version, like, get it right this time.
Yeah. I'm kind of toyed out. Do you guys have any other points?
I guess just one thing I'd say is, if anything, I'm relieved that this serial kind of existed to preempt the Mind Robber, with the Mind Robber being so much better in every single way, and in so many of the same ways as well. Because I think when the King and Queen of Hearts turn up, it kind of feels a bit like Alice in Wonderland or something has intruded on the story, and that feels almost like a prefiguring of what we eventually get with the Mind Robber. Yeah, and the whole thing that that Davis tries to do with this rewrite of introducing like Billy Bunter type character, or like Sergeant Rugg and Mrs. Wiggs, who I think he described as being from an old pantomime sketch, but actually when Alan Barnes researched it, he couldn't find anything about that. So it's almost like the premise is that they're drawn from some kind of fiction, but we don't actually know where, and it's not clear if that's even true. It feels like it is doing a proto-Mind Robber kind of thing, in having like this cultural relevance sort of leak in this very abstract way. but everything is done like so much more interestingly. At the start of the story, with the memory window that the Toymaker has, where Stephen can see one thing and Dodo can't see it, that same thing is done in Mind Robber when we get the screen that's showing a different thing to Jamie and to Zoe. So in so many ways, this feels like Mind Robber 0.1. And Mind Robber is like a true, like, fucking stone cold classic in my view. So if at any point in the steps to getting the Mind Robber, like the flopping of Celestial Toymaker was like a key role, and maybe it wasn't, maybe there's no like real like link there, but I'm glad that we could get like a much better interpretation of these concepts, even if it took like a really shit version of them first.
Yeah. Okay, that was interesting. It was a shame, like Unearthly, we were able to go, yeah, this is actually pretty great in so many ways. And this was kind of, no, this is pretty thin.
Yeah, there is something, like, going from Unearthly Child to this, it's like, oh my god, what happened? It really is like going from, like, Heaven Sent to, like, Once Upon a Time, you know, or like The Vanquishers. It's just, I think that the decline there is painful. From a show that is so character-led and is so, like, full of themes and so engaged with what it's doing, to, like, the Doctor's disembodied hand and Stephen and Dodo playing hopscotch, whatever, for the 3 episodes. It's so bad. Like, oh, it hurts seeing the show, like, go downhill so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. The direction really struck me, just so much less creative, less visually interesting.
It was so static in the first 3 episodes. So that wraps up our discussion of 1966's The Celestial Toymaker serial from Doctor Who's 3rd season. What do you think of this story, of the Toymaker character, of the way the story got made, of the things in the story, the things out of the story, how the story's been looked at since it got made? How did you experience the story? Did you read the book? Did you watch the recons? Did you listen to the soundtracks? Did you not do any of those? How have you come to the story? I actually think that's really interesting to hear how people experience or don't experience the missing stories in their own ways. So yeah, please actually comment about that. I'm quite fascinated how other people have gone through it. And yeah, what did you think of what we had to say as well? Please join in and let us know your thoughts, because this is a story you keep talking about for one reason or another. So it's always interesting to see others' opinions on it. And thanks as always for listening. Cheers.